nature is designed in a way that is much more intelligent and much more effective than we currently design products. It doesn't need a landfill. This is something that we've kind of put on the planet.
Hey folks, thanks for checking out the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Today's guest is David Stover, the co-founder of a company called Bureo that I've been tracking for quite a while now. I first came across Bureo through Patagonia, which was an early backer and customer for its products. Now Bureo has brand partners across the apparel and outdoor space, from YETI and REI to Rivian and Outerknown. And if you listen to our episode with Outerknown co-founder John Moore, Outerknown goes the extra mile to partner with only the most responsible suppliers. As you hear David explain, Bureo is tackling the problem of discarded fishing nets in our oceans by working with local communities and governments to set up collection points and create end-of-life solutions to turn those discarded fishing nets into a recycled material suitable for everything from hat brims and skateboards to gear like rain jackets and Patagonia's iconic Baggies shorts. With this podcast, we start at the start. You'll hear about how David connected with the ocean as a child on Block Island and how maintaining that connection with the ocean helps him think clearly and operate efficiently as an entrepreneur. Despite some pretty scary stats about the levels of virgin plastic production, I think you'll come away hopeful that there are people and companies taking steps to challenge some of the biggest problems our world is facing today. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with David Stover, co-founder of Bureo. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are stoked to have David Stover, co-founder of Bureo. Thanks for joining us today, David.
Thanks, Rick. Happy to be here.
Let's start where we usually start with our guests. How do you think about and define your relationship with nature?
I was born in a area of the East Coast, not around the ocean, but when my parents were pretty young into their career, and when I was 6, they moved to a small island called Block Island in the Northeast. And so I actually grew up in a very small community of about 800 winter residents, brutal, cold Northeast winters and glorious summers. And I was fortunate to spend a lot of time around the ocean, whether that was surfing or exploring or going on endless hikes around the island. So I think at a very young age, just developed a connection to the ocean and always cared for it. I never knew what a beach cleanup was before I was 20 years old, but we always would just pick up trash when we went to the beach as kids, and everything around school was always about getting out and going for a surf after. And certainly the summers from when I was 7 years old were going to the beach as soon as I could in the morning and staying as long as I could and riding my bike home. And I think that kind of has stayed with me my whole life. And even now, kind of being into my working career, having a career around the ocean and being able to wake up on a lot of mornings and go for surfs before I get into work has really kind of been a consistent theme throughout my life. And I definitely know that when I'm away from the ocean or away from nature, I can kind of feel it. I'm not thinking as clearly. I'm not operating efficiently. And those moments when I get to go back and reset and go in the ocean, it kind of wipes away that backlog and refreshes and lets me think clearly. And so I'd say my whole operating system and the way that I function kind of works around nature and really is reliant on it.
And that makes a lot of sense, talking about how this connection with nature allows you to sort of reset and reframe and come at things fresh. You're the co-founder of a company called Bureo, and I was watching a video on YouTube where you said, in nature, there is no waste. So can you explain that idea, how that informs part of what you're doing at Bureo and why you started it?
You know, I'm 38 now, and when I was young 30 years ago, waste was very much a problem. But I think I wasn't as aware of the problem until, I was in my 20s and traveling around the world. And this idea that nature obviously takes care of itself. When a tree drops fruit or leaves, it decomposes and that becomes nutrients for the tree. Nature is designed in a way that is much more intelligent and much more effective than we currently design products. When I started working and traveling around the world, this was something actually that was told to me in several places that I went to, and two specific ones that stick out. I was traveling in Indonesia And I've heard other people tell this story, by the way. I think a lot of people have had this reaction in going to small places, but I was sitting in a little warung, like a little cafe on the cliff after I went for a surf in this beautiful place in Indonesia, and I watched the restaurant close, pick the trash up and throw it off the cliff into the ocean. And so I remember that really like tugged at me because I grew up around the ocean, knew that was never the right thing to do. So I was asking some of the locals just about the problem of plastic waste and kind of why people did this. And, it was said to me that forever on this island, food was packaged in leaves or bananas and everything took care of itself. You could just purchase things, drop the package on the ground, it would decompose, and that would be it. And then once plastic started to be shipped into these remote areas, that's when it became a burden. And there wasn't really solutions other than putting it into a landfill or burning it. And when we started working in Chile, I heard the same exact thing in the remote communities we went to, that obviously very different culture than Indonesia, very far away, not a lot of similarities as far as the government or the structures or the economy. But that was a very similar reaction. Remote towns in Chile, where they were talking about a lot of the small stores had all these shampoos and food that's sent in small plastic packaging, but there was no solution for it. And they were talking about back on a time when everything was made from natural fibers, even fishing nets were made from jute, and clothing was made from cotton and hemp, and packaging all came in paper or things that decomposed. Nature wasn't designing this waste system. It doesn't need a landfill. This is something that we've kind of put on the planet. And I think that we can design our way out of that, but we are the source of why waste is a problem here.
It's a really good point. You just mentioned that originally fishing nets were made out of a decomposable, a biodegradable material. Yep. I think it's interesting when you talk about plastic being introduced into these systems, but even in the US or other Western countries, global North countries, we didn't even think about what that would mean in terms of its end of life. So not to, I guess, over-egg the pudding a little bit, but in terms of Bureo, you're trying to implement a solution that helps figure out, at least with fishing nets, how to take care of those materials after their useful life.
Yeah, I think our kind of journey really started pretty simply and honestly pretty naive. It was just looking at this issue of seeing plastic waste in the ocean. And I think, when you spend time around the ocean, you just realize your connection is different to that body of water. Like a lot of people look at the ocean as a beautiful space, but I spend a lot of time surfing, and I think the connection you have, you take things personally. And our team, Ben and Kevin, who are co-founders, and certainly a lot of our team now, who spend a lot of time in the water, this is something that we were just very passionate about. And so I think when we started out, it was, hey, we want to do something about this. We want to work to keep plastic out of our ocean. For us, that meant figuring out a way to block it from entering it and putting it into products that would add some positivity to this light. And I think that's definitely the journey that we're still on. But I do think that we are starting to play a bigger role and starting to play a bigger role with companies and industries about just understanding the relationship with plastic. Plastic really shouldn't be used in all the products it's used in. We should be really reducing our consumption in a lot of places. And if plastic is an effective material for certain applications, it has properties that are favorable, whether that's being waterproof or light or long lasting, that certainly from a performance basis are higher than natural fibers in certain cases. But we have to use that in a way where that product is built to last a really long time. We have to build in potential end of life and really change the way that we work with plastic and design it into the ecosystem. Because right now, to be pessimistic, we're losing this battle about reducing plastic consumption. I think that there's been a lot of gains on interest and demand for recycled products, but we're not seeing a reduction in new plastic production every year. And so that's an indicator that overall the system is still being overburdened with this waste, and we haven't turned the corner on making a difference yet.
Yeah. So Bureo goes and works in these communities to try to reduce the amount of plastic in our oceans through collecting these fishing nets and fishing gear made out of plastic. And then the output is a pellet that's called Net Plus. So what does that whole process look like? How do you get the materials? How do you work with the local communities? And then what happens at the end of it when you have these pellets?
Yeah, so our process has evolved, but I'll start in the beginning. I mean, quite simply, in thinking about this waste problem, I mentioned a lot of more remote areas. It's not just remote areas, even in cities. We have a broken waste system where it's not really designed for an end of life. It's really difficult to manage and kind of recycle effectively. So, one thing, good advice that we had early on and that has really stayed with us is figure out, if you will, like kind of a clear body of water where we can operate. And for us, that was in fishing nets. We didn't see a lot of work going on 10 years ago in this space. It was clearly a high percentage of the waste in the ocean. I think estimates now are around 10%. And this was something that we could focus on. And that was advice we got early on, is that you're never going to be able to tackle everything. Plastic's a complex issue. It's coming from a lot of sources. Find one area where you can be effective. And so our program is really based on educating fisheries, working with local governments, local communities to establish kind of collection points and to really put some positivity into this problem, recognizing, like other types of waste, fishing nets are complicated, they're heavy, they're dirty. We can come in, help manage the logistics, hire local labor, set up a facility, and effectively manage this waste at the end of life, and then really bring that through a supply chain that sees that going into products. And so from a process standpoint, our major function at Bureo is the facility and the interface between when that net would typically become a waste and then when it enters the supply chain for recycling. And so when we inbound that material, there's a lot of manual sorting. So we have to be really consistent for recycling. Recycling programs are really challenged by consistency of material and logistics costs, like how you're collecting and how you're transporting it. And so for us, we try to efficiently get the nets into a central location. And then we have to be very diligent on separating materials and making sure we're only recycling high density polyethylene or nylon, which are our two main feedstocks. So that does take a lot of sorting and cutting, manual labor. From there, there's a lot of cleaning. We go through industrial washing. You need to have a very consistent, clean feedstock to be effective. And then all of our nets go through mechanical shredding, so size reduction into a little short fiber. And traditionally, like originally in the program, all of that would have been melted into the pellet, which is the Net Plus material we have produced from 100% recycled material. We still do that for a portion of our business. It's a mechanical recycled, kind of simple melting of the process. Certainly for our first product, the skateboard, and other products we support, it's been through that. And then most recently with Patagonia, we've worked on a kind of lengthy research project on moving nylon fishing nets into a recycled yarn. That's a high performance, kind of more technical application. So we've really relied on Patagonia's supply chain partners. They're implementing more of an advanced recycling process. It's depolymerization. So they're actually breaking down the plastic and chemically rebuilding it into the kind of original polymer. And that's obviously a more energy intensive process. So it's not as low footprint as mechanical recycling, but you are able to build back the polymer to almost 100% virgin quality. So you can make pretty much anything you want out of it without limitation. And so we're running both that mechanical process, and then we're also involved in that kind of depolymerization process, which is a more advanced recycling now.
That's awesome. I remember getting my first Bureo product, a Frisbee, at the Patagonia store in Santa Monica when I was living in Venice. Maybe putting on our optimistic hat, let's say, hopefully sooner rather than later, we've realized that certain applications of plastic don't work, or maybe the Bureo system has helped figure out how to do recycling so effectively that we don't need to collect it from the ocean anymore. Have you thought about, does Bureo ideally go out of business at some point, or are there other materials? Are there other ways of thinking about this, or maybe even just the systems replicated for other materials? Like, how have you thought about the future of the company, given that if it's successful, it could kind of put itself out of business in some ways?
Yeah, we always joked about that early on, even before we had a grasp on just how big, plastic right now, the plastics industry is still pumping out over 300 million tons of new plastic a year. So unfortunately, there's more work to be done than anyone could feasibly get done in a lifetime when it comes to recycling plastic. But For fishing nets in particular, one thing we said early on was, we can walk away knowing we did something positive if it came to us running out of feedstock. Unfortunately, the reality right now, I think that it's going to take a complete system change to really solve the plastic problem. Recycling will never be able to 100% keep up with new plastic production. So I think you were kind of alluding to that. That we just need a redesign of certainly single-use plastics that are like 50% of that volume. There's no reason for something that people hold in their hand for 5 minutes is made from material that lasts a couple hundred years or could last a couple hundred years. So I think that it's going to take not just recycling solutions, but also just redesigning products, eliminating the use of plastic where it doesn't need to be used, looking at new types of plastic. I'm not optimistic that we need 100 or 200 different types of new plastic, but I think kind of landing on new types that have lower environmental impact, that are truly compostable and biodegradable will be positive for a lot of applications. And then for the cases of kind of higher engineered polymers, I think in isolated niche cases, recycling will work. You look at the automotive industry, you look at apparel, certainly you look at what we're doing for fishing nets, targeting kind of bulk feedstocks, the material, and trying to keep them in the economy and really offsetting virgin production. I mentioned it before, but I think we'll really start to see a difference when we can start looking at petrochemical and new plastic production and starting to see declines of virgin production because people are redesigning and really relying on recycling feedstocks. I think when we started, we were thinking about early on, okay, fishing nets, and then what is after that? And we talked about climbing ropes and agriculture waste and other types of waste streams that we could go after. But realistically, everything that we've learned about the space, we have a lifetime of work certainly ahead of us to try to replicate this program to recycle fishing nets.
As someone who has a deep connection with the ocean, but also now a lot of technical knowledge, where do you think the leverage point is? What is it going to take to sort of transform the system? Is it more entrepreneurs? Is it more government? Is it, people lobbying their politicians? Where do you think that leverage point is when it comes to kind of, if not reducing, eliminating the plastic problem?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think an important one too. I think the thing that we try to say a lot is that there's no single bullet solution right now. It's going to take this portfolio of solutions. I think that certainly regulation is not always something that needs to be leaned on. For the case of plastic, I think it has to be. I think, unfortunately, the economics of how cheap it is to make virgin plastic right now, I think that personally, I believe that kind of the extractive nature of going after fossil fuels and the subsidies that are in that and the kind of the price point that they're able to develop new plastics, nowhere in that supply chain is any cost to the environment factored in, or very little, right? We're seeing that in the US right now. There's a lot of backlash over some of the new EPA regulations for air quality. And I think historically that industry has had so much leverage because they're so large that they've been able to kind of flood the market with cheap plastic. And because of that, it really hampers certainly recycling programs, which they're a cost to operate. It kind of hampers new materials, which are obviously more expensive. So I do think it's going to take some regulatory pressure, whether that's taxing new plastics or putting extended producer responsibility or putting kind of minimum recycling percentages for industries, which we're starting to see all that happening. I know we've been working in the apparel space quite a bit, and I think there's like 35 or 40 regulations going on around the world right now to address kind of sustainability or responsible feedstocks for apparel. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And we really need to get away from this model where we can just rely on cheap, easy to get material that's kind of flooded into the market without really any cost or end of life associated to it, and moving towards what are more responsible materials that we designed end of life, that we've thought about kind of the impact on the environment.
To bring our conversation to close, I'd love to get some insight on how you, as a person who's passionate about the oceans, And you as a business person who, working with Patagonia is probably fairly easy in terms of alignment of values. But when you start to look at others in sort of the apparel space and other industries that use plastic, like how do you balance your personal passions for protecting the ocean with the interest of coming in with at least enough of a balanced point of view that you can help make some progress, even if you aren't changing the whole system in one go? How do you balance the passion and the actual progress you want to make?
Yeah, I mean that last point you made, I think getting away from the purity test and thinking that everything has to be perfect to do anything and trying to like look at, okay, how do we make incremental differences, right? I mean, for us in the nylon space that we kind of focus on now for recycling, that industry is producing 5 million tons of nylon a year. 99% of that or 98% of it is virgin. So we are very much a drop in the bucket in that industry, but making incremental changes, knowing that, we're inspiring the next generation, knowing that every product that has our label on it, if that story can reach the consumer and they can think about their habits and their consumption differently, if we've given them awareness on their relationship with plastic or where it came from or how products can be designed and made differently, I think it's just moving ahead incrementally and just trying to get better every year and kind of pushing for that really cleaner tomorrow that we all want. And that gives me hope, especially someone that enjoys going in the ocean and you can be in the craziest, dirtiest city and you can find a surf break and get in the ocean and feel the furthest from waste or problems, even though we know there's kind of issues with toxins in the water. And that gives me hope that the environment can be resilient and our population and generations are changing and people are starting to understand kind of the gravity of the situation and what's happening with the climate. And so I am hopeful that the next generation is learning from these incremental positive changes that we're having.
Yeah, one step in front of the other is better than no steps at all. So thank you so much, David, for
Exactly.
joining us. I think this is a great conversation, especially inspiring for, I know, some of our listeners who are either trying to start their own companies or get involved in sort of these initiatives. So thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick. Enjoyed it.